for having me. I'd like to thank Irene for inviting me. So I guess the big question is, of course, why wrestling? As most people realize, I can hear the thing, I didn't realize there was wrestling and that much to write a book this big about. So, as I mentioned, during the pandemic, I was writing for various sports sites, and I decided that maybe I would squeak in an article about Windsor because I knew that we had two wrestling Hall of Famers that came from here, Killer Kowalski and Abdullah the Butcher. And I was shocked to learn that many people and a lot of people in Windsor didn't realize either one of them came from Windsor. So I realized quite early on that I would have a lot more to educate about some of the people. And these guys are both in the WWE Hall of Fame. So that's pretty much the pinnacle of sports entertainment world. So these two Windsorites have been internationally recognized as being major players in the history of professional wrestling. And so I decided to write an article, and that article turned into, well, I think I might have a series for you of at least 3 articles. And then I realized, well, maybe it'll be a 9-part series. And then I realized that there was not one of the magazines that I was writing for was going to invest in a 9-part series on Windsor, Ontario. So that's when it kind of came about that I was going to look into this book. And I didn't realize it was going to take me 3 years, but it turned into that one of those things that I thought I knew a whole lot going into writing the book. And I would say 95% of what I wrote in the book, I had no idea about until I started reading into it. First of all, I didn't realize it went back quite so long. I've got cover over 100 years of history. The first noted wrestler is from the 1880s and was from Walkerville, and the man named Herbert Ellis, who won a championship over in Michigan. That was back when it was still mostly on a level. By about the 1900s, it did switch to more because it kind of came out of the carnival representation of the strongmen of the competitions that you would try and beat. A lot of times they were plants or marks, as they refer to them, because they would mark the gullible people with chalk so that the carny announcer would know which guys to pick on. But the first actual wrestling promotion here in Windsor started in 1929. And they started at the Armories in downtown Windsor. And I had Ed Strangler Lewis, who was a monstrously huge sports star. In fact, he was one of the highest paid sports celebrities in the entire North America at that time. Back then, wrestling was probably second only to hockey as far as sports coverage. And that was one of the really interesting things about researching this was I read probably 100 years worth of sports sections of the Windsor Star. And from 1929 until the 60s, they treated it as if it was an official sport. So they would have the full documented write-ups of what happened in every show. And like I said, it was second only to the NHL until about the 50s, until the NBA and Major League Baseball started to pick up with a lot more steam. But pro wrestling was the second biggest sport in Canada after the NHL. So one of the things about the book was to go through looking at all the promotions that have been in Windsor starting in 1929, and we've had consecutive promotions running here since 1929, and it's still going on today. We've had Border City Wrestling has been running shows in this area from LaSalle to Essex to Old Castle, Windsor. They've been running shows since 1993, so they just celebrated their 31st anniversary. And then there's a new promotion that's actually starting this weekend, Maple Leaf Pro Wrestling. It's a reboot of Maple Leaf Wrestling out of Toronto, but it's actually going to be Windsor based, and it's going to be the first national promotion that's ever been for Canada. The US has had WWF, WWE. Various countries have had their own promotions, but Canada's never had their own national promotion, at least not to the extent that he's hoping to do with this one. So it is on pay-per-view this weekend.
Where are they doing that?
St. Clair College. So they're taping out of St. Clair College, and it's going to be on pay-per-view on Pillar TV, which is the big. It used to be Fight TV, but now it's Triller TV. So it ended up becoming the 600-year odyssey, looking at over 100 years worth of wrestling history. And it's really almost part of a local history book. I've got a bit of ADHD, which you can definitely tell in the book because kind of the tangents go off. But I tried to incorporate a lot of local history. So you don't necessarily have to be a wrestling fan to enjoy some of the stories. You don't necessarily have to be from Windsor to enjoy the wrestling part of it. But there was so many classic venues. From the Coral Gables Dance Hall was used as wrestling. The Windsor Market Building, where the casino is now, was used for wrestling all through the 1940s through the 60s. Windsor Arena, of course, was our Madison Square Gardens, and they had wrestling from 1930 until 1993. So that's a pretty 63-year run of hosting professional wrestling at the arena. Some of the other key people in here was Sandy Barker, was an African descent wrestler that lived here in the 60s, and she moved here from Vancouver to become a pro wrestler. She trained over in Detroit, and her big claim to fame is she was the first African descent woman to win a world championship in professional wrestling. So she was right here in Windsor. So that was a pretty monstrous accomplishment. One that just doesn't get talked about very often, because she won the championship in Japan. And back then, this was in 1973. And back then, a lot of that news didn't travel quite so easily as it does nowadays. But glad to say that in the last 5 years, she's starting to get her recognition, which has been fantastic. But just another great chapter in some of the key people we've had. Now, when I say we haven't had a national Canadian promotion, that's not entirely true. We did have one briefly from about 75 to about 84. It was called George Cannon Superstars of Wrestling, and George Cannon was from Windsor as well. So it's kind of funny that the last time we did have a national promotion was from a Windsorite, and now we've got another one coming again from another Windsorite, and that's Scott Demore. His family is Demore Construction. So it's just, there's actually quite, one of the things you'll learn in the book is that there's quite a few construction companies that were founded by professional wrestlers. Riverside Roofing was started by Steve Zold, who was a professional wrestler. And then Demore Construction, which is Scott Demore's family. And Vollmer was originally started off as Laddie Hollick's construction business. So that was another professional wrestler. And then Bravo Cement, Bravo was a professional wrestler for 10 years. And in the 1950s or 1960s, sorry. So in a way, you could say that wrestling literally built Windsor in the last 60 years or so. So the book is available to get on Amazon, and there is available in several bookstores around the area. Juniper Books, it's available at Rose Gallery Comics in downtown. It's also available at the Chimchuck Museum, and it's also available in Amherstburg at the River Bookshop. And I generally tend to find it gets more interesting info if we do a bit of a Q&A. So I thought if anyone had any questions about potential 100-year history of professional wrestling.
So at the height of Windsor's reign in wrestling, did it pay well to those that won?
It sure did. I mean, it was kind of a storyline gimmick that you get more if you win. You kind of get paid. I mean, the champions did get a higher percentage of the pay window, but generally you got paid the same, regardless whether you won or lost. Because Drew and the Santa Claus in the room, the wrestling is predetermined.
No. Come on.
They're ruined it for everybody. But the athleticism is definitely real, and a lot of the physical contact is definitely real. A lot of people have definitely suffered some rather severe injuries, and there have been many wrestlers who have passed away in the ring from their injuries. So the physicality is definitely real. It's just the end result is it's a little skewed.
Can you elaborate a little bit? You mentioned Abdullah the Butcher.
Yes.
Now, I never thought about Abdullah the Butcher lived next door to my husband.
Oh, did he?
In-laws
Yeah,
when he was growing up. I know nothing about him. Can you?
Larry
tell-
Shreve.
Can you tell me, like, what did he win or
Well,
was he around like he was older than the figurines of Hulk Hogan?
oh, yes, yeah, he started in this area in about 64.
Okay.
He started off originally, his name was Zealous Amara, was his real name's Larry Shreve. But he started as this sort of exotic, I guess, almost like an African prince named Zealous Amara. And he started off in the Detroit area, and he wasn't doing all that well, unfortunately, because he was a very physical, kind of wild person. And unfortunately, Detroit had their own version of that character, the Sheik. And a lot of people will remember him. He was a bit of a wild man with his pencil stabbing people, and
Nice.
that blood was real, unfortunately. So it wasn't fun getting stabbed by Joe. Of course, Abdullah the Butcher had a fork, so he took it one step further. But he wasn't doing all that well and wasn't getting booked all that well here. And it was actually George Cannon, who I had mentioned, who was from Windsor, who ended up helping send him out to Vancouver to work on the West Coast, thinking, you know what, we'll send you all the way across the country and get you set up over there, and maybe you can kind of work and develop your own character. And he had one match out there, and it was so wild it caused a riot. And the promoter there said, I think we should change your name because you were a butcher out there. So they turned him into Abdul the Butcher out there. And he actually became a main event, which meant that he was getting the last match in the card and he was fighting the champions. And he became such a huge draw in Western Canada that it exposed him to the rest of North America. And he ended up becoming a monstrously huge star in Japan. And he even did a couple of films in Canada, in North America. During the 70s, he was one of the biggest villains in the professional wrestling world. And he was always billed as the madman from Sudan. So that's why a lot of people, and he never spoke English when he was on TV. He'd always spoken in sort of unintelligible garbles. And so that's why a lot of people don't realize he's actually from Windsor, because they thought he was from Sudan, but no, he's definitely a Windsorite, and he's still got lots of family here.
There's a handout.
Phyllis's iPad.
Phyllis or Paul?
Yeah, hi, you're probably not surprised that it's Paul, not Phyllis, with this question or comment, but
I thought Phyllis was big into wrestling.
yeah. And you just sort of touched on this since I put my hand up, but one of my favorite signature moves was the sleeper hold. And I'm trying to remember who that was that did that. Do you recall that, or was that Bobo Brazil or something?
I don't know. No, he did the
He did the cocoa butt.
Yeah, was it Dick the Bruiser maybe? I don't know, but
Might have been Dick the Bruiser, because he would kind of choke the guys out. Because Killer Kowalski used the claw. He had the claw. Yeah, there was that movie, The Iron Claw, that just came out recently, but that guy, Fritz von Erich, used the claw to the head. Killer Kowalski would use it to the gut. He would grab you by the stomach and squeeze it.
disembowel you or something. Yeah.
Yes, he was about 6'8", so he was a big guy. So I'm sure his hands were monstrous and would probably take up my entire abdomen. But yeah, I think it was probably Dick the Bruiser that used it, and he was probably the biggest star in not from Windsor, but he wrestled in Windsor from about 1959 to the early to mid 60s, and he was probably the king of Windsor and Detroit for that 5-6 years. And it's one of the names that I find a lot of people. I interviewed over 70 people for the book, including wrestlers who were here in the 40s and 50s. Some of them I interviewed were children of wrestlers from the 50s, 30s, and 40s.
So I used to work in Hamilton, and I worked with a fellow, Ange Mosca.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, and so he and his dad, like senior, I guess
Yeah.
they used to do the
Oh, yeah.
Florida circuit, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Big Ange was probably actually funny enough, I'm actually just starting writing my second book, which is actually the history of Maple Leaf Wrestling, which is the Toronto area. And Angelo Mosco's.
Cause he was a football player too.
Yeah,
originally.
that was
with
a Ticats, yeah.
Yeah.
But he was a huge part of the Toronto scene. So yeah, Ange Moscow,
Yeah.
King Kong Moscow,
Yeah.
he was huge.
Just, it strikes me that back in the day, going back 50 years or so ago, that there were all these circuits that were all over North America.
Absolutely.
'Cause, I grew up in Northern Ontario and then moved to Eastern Ontario, and it's a whole different set of wrestlers, but
Oh, yes,
it's the same. There was a butcher,
Paul Butcher Vachon.
yeah.
Yeah, I interviewed him for the
The
book,
Mad
actually.
Dog's brother.
Yeah. Actually, both of the Vachon brothers started in Windsor.
They did, huh?
They're from Montreal, but Maurice Vachon was a Canadian Olympian in the 1948 Olympics, and or it was amateur wrestling, and they didn't want him to start in Montreal because he was quite famously well known. He was a famous Olympian, so he actually wore a mask at first. Just in case he stunk it at the pro wrestling, they didn't want to ruin his good Olympian nature reputation. But he was sent down to Windsor, Detroit to train for professional wrestling, because there's obviously very different circumstances and situations. And then Paul, his younger brother, got sent down to train here as well, and he was a Russian character at first, Nikolai Zolotov. Yes.
You talked about professional wrestling and for entertainment, but it's a lot, very physical.
Oh,
You
yes.
talk about the training they have to go through to practice. and make
Yeah,
sure
absolutely.
They do their tricks, but also don't hurt themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I mean, it's the hardest thing in the world is to fight somebody and not hurt them. And I don't know too many of the trade secrets, unfortunately. I try to stay as far. I want to keep the wizard behind the curtain for the most part. I like the suspension of disbelief, and when I watch it with my son, it's nice to kind of step into his brain for a second and watch it like a 12-year-old. But actually, speaking of the training, though, one of the most respected wrestling schools in the world is actually here in Windsor. Scott D'Amour's Can-Am Wrestling School has trained countless. In fact, I've got a list at the back of the book of all the champions, world champions from around the world that he's trained. Still trains. He's been training for 30 years, and there's guys in WWE and almost every major television promotion have gone through there. So it's interesting that most of Windsor's wrestling history is unknown to most. I find that more people outside of Windsor know more about Windsor's wrestling history than Windsor itself. That was one thing I noticed even when I was covering, because I covered the local music scene for about 20 years, about 15 years. And one of the things I noticed was that Windsor has a bad habit of not recognizing its own until somebody else says it's okay. And there was a lot of musical bands that it would pulling teeth to get newspapers to let me cover them. And then sure enough, a year later, they'd be touring, and because the Toronto Star suddenly said they were a band to watch, suddenly it was okay for me to write about them again, even though we tried to not warn people, I suppose, but inform people that we've got these world-class talents in the city. And until somebody else says it's okay, sometimes the Windsor media can be a little skeptical in pushing our own, which always kind of upset me a little bit. So I found a lot of that similar mentality was with the wrestling. And I think a lot of it's just that people just tend not to really consider that Windsor has anything of that kind of caliber. But it definitely does.
But it used to be, now, I'm very young, I look a little older than I.
Me
It
too.
used to be late at night would be when wrestling was on TV.
Yeah.
Right? And then if you stayed up even later than that, you could watch roller movie.
Yeah.
But now, black and white. Of course in black and white. Maybe it was in color in other people's houses, I don't know. But my point was is where do you see, like, where do kids follow wrestling? Is it all on pay-per-view now?
Pay-per-view is sort of the monthly attraction, and then there's weekly television that builds up to it. So the stories kind of build up to the big payoff. So it's almost like, for example, WWE has their Monday night show, Monday Night Raw,
Okay, right.
and then their pay-per-views at the end of the month. So for 4 weeks, they kind of tell a story. So it's almost like it's like a Rocky movie. The first 3/4 of the movie is the TV shows, and then the big final fight's the pay-per-view. So they kind of build you up and string you along that way. And there's multiple promotions now. Wrestling is actually bigger now than it's been at any point in history. There was definitely more viewers a while back, but now there's so many channels that it's almost impossible for any TV show to get the ratings they got even 10 years ago. But the national promotion that's starting this weekend here in Windsor, Maple Leaf Pro at St. Clair College, I know that they are looking to get on TV starting the new year. So that'll be pretty cool to get national TV once again coming from Windsor.
Yes, can you maybe outline some humorous moments that happened in wrestling that caught everybody by surprise?
Well, one of the oddest things was Weigel Park briefly was holding wrestling in the summer. They would get about 1,000 or so people crammed into the park there. And there was one where there was the little people were in the main event, and the bad guys won that night. And I don't know why, because there were far bigger names at other cards and so forth, but for some reason, the villainous little people winning the match upset the entire crowd, and they had a riot. All the police forces the police had to come and the police had to come and escort the little people out, and then there was people tearing up the park. They were throwing everything, and they actually ended up suspending wrestling at Weigel Park for about 3-4 years. And it's just of all the crazy matches that happened over the course, that was the one that people were that invested in. The wrong guys won, and suddenly all of Windsor's police force are being called to Weigel Park to break up a riot.
What years were that?
That would have been, let me see, because I've got a.
60s or early?
I think it would have been in the 50s.
50s?
Because the little people they were based out of the troop. We were mentioning about how the different circuits. So in 1948, there was a group called the National Wrestling Alliance that was formed, the NWA. And it was sort of a governing body for all the different cities. So that way nobody would encroach in other people's cities or territories, as they call them. Windsor was actually considered part of the Detroit territory. We were just a little too far away from Toronto to be considered part of Toronto's. But so, about 1949 or so, a guy from Montreal, Jack Britton, came down, and he organized the troop of all the little people that he would bring around North America at all these different territories. And he used Windsor was a lot of wrestlers would come and live in Windsor because we were such a central location. We were 4 hours to Toronto, 4 hours to Chicago, and Chicago was, for a good chunk of from the 40s to the 60s, Chicago was almost the wrestling mecca, because that's where one of the only national wrestling TV shows came out of, was out of Chicago. So if you wanted to get on TV and be seen around the world, you had to wrestle in Chicago. So a lot of them you could go to Chicago, they had Detroit, they had Toronto, Montreal wasn't even that too far away in the grand scheme of things, New York City, Boston. So that really made Windsor an appealing location for a lot of people here in those years.
Thank you very much.
You're very
for
welcome.
being on. We're gonna have Jude say thank you to you.